Woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Oh, woke up this morning with
I am the Reverend Lukata Mjumbe, and I am the Executive Director of the Alabama African American Civil Rights Heritage Sites Consortium. In this episode of the Stayed on Freedom podcast, we travel to the state of Mississippi to sit down and to talk with Dr. Roy DeBerry, an accomplished scholar and political scientist who grew up in Hollis Springs, Mississippi. Now, before all of his awards and his credentials, he recently received an honorary doctorate of letters from Brandeis University in Boston, Massachusetts. Before all of that, he was a child of Mississippi, coming out of a family with deep roots and connections to the land and commitment to community, to education, and to freedom. Dr. DeBerry was in elementary school when the United States Supreme Court issued the famous Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas decision, which supposedly desegregated our schools. In 1955, Dr. DeBerry was an 8-year-old child that was terrified and horrified by the brutal murder of Emmett Till in the state of Mississippi that shocked the entire nation and the world. And at the age of 14, 15, he began to work alongside activists and organizers from groups such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Council of Federated Organizations, working as a part of Freedom Summer 1964. Voter registration, organization, preparation for the coming presidential election of 1964. And Dr. DeBerry also remembers what happened on June 21st, 1964, when 3 civil rights workers, one from Mississippi, James Chaney, and 2 who came from up north, Mickey Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, were murdered, and their bodies were found in a shallow grave on August 4th, 1964. We traveled to Mississippi to learn about the legacy not only of violence, not only of struggle, not only of poverty, but the legacy of those who dared to stand up, to fight, and to be stayed on freedom. But I'd like for you to tell us a little bit about what was Mississippi Freedom Summer in terms of its purpose, in terms of why they did it. What was happening in Mississippi in terms of the work, but also in terms of the reaction and the violence that was happening? Because in Alabama, we've been inspired by Mississippi. And what we've done this summer is what we've called Alabama Freedom Summer 2024. And we've tried to encourage people from around the country to come to Alabama, to come to the sites, to invest in projects and work. But the legacy and the work of Freedom Summer extended beyond just the summer.
Vets coming from World War II, Medgar Evers, Charles Evers, brothers down in a place called, I want to say Decatur, which is similar to Decatur, Georgia, but Decatur, Mississippi. And I tried to register to vote, was stopped and beaten and turned away. So this voter registration thing, vets haven't said, okay, we saw freedom abroad, we went to fight for freedom, so let's come back and let's do something. And we have some agency now that some of the local people may not have. Medgar later on, as you know, went and tried to get into the University of Mississippi. That was before Jane Meredith, again turned down. Rather than have the NAACP did not take up the case, what they did was they saw this young man, this brilliant young man, and so they asked him to become their field secretary, right? Which he did. Did some great work in terms of organizing chapters throughout the state of Mississippi, including investigate the murder of Emmett Till in '55. Make a long story short, did great work. Was killed in '63.
June 12, 1963.
Exactly. We wrote a play. When I say we, high school kids from Hollis Springs wrote a play about the death of Medgar Evers called Seeds of Freedom. The young man that tried to get into Southern University, Kennard.
Kennard, yeah.
Yeah, and of course, a brilliant young man from Mississippi, had also been a vet, came back with fun, bought him, he and his mama a farm down south of Hattiesburg, down in Forest County. Applied to Southern University, again, part of the game plan on the part of the governor and a missions officer and the president of the college. Came up with all kinds of reasons why he couldn't get accepted. They finally admitted that the man had the credentials, and so they had to find out some other reason. And they came up with some crazy thing about he needed to get like 10 white alumni of Southern to vouch for him before he can get in. Now, it's almost like counting bubbles in a job, right? So, make a long story short, they framed him, say he stole some chicken feed. He ended up going to prison, and that way he
Parchman prison?
Parchman. And he was diagnosed with cancer. They knew he had cancer, would not treat him. And so finally the pressure was put on just before he got out to let him out, and then he died, right? So that all happened, and a lot of people don't know about that. That even happened before Jane Merritt did, right? Anyway, Jane Merritt got in 62. 62, troops came through Holly Springs. My brother Melvin and I, as youngsters there, stood on the square and walked 30,000 federal troops come through. We said to ourselves, where are we? In a war? Kennedy had obviously nationalized the National Guard, so they came in, had a ride down here at the campus. 2 people got killed. So all that was set in the context for what happened with Freedom Summer. So by the time Freedom Summer came along, the local people, either COFO, through council, SCLC, SNCC, CORE, and there's one other. But anyway, they made a council federated organization of COFO. COFO had initially been founded in 61 to deal with the Freedom Riders, right? They came in and they arrested them in Jackson and sold 9 yards. So voting was the focus. Voter registration. You have a lot of black people in Mississippi, only a small percentage are registered to vote. So local people have been working on that for years, had not made much headway. Bob Moses, who's the architect behind Freedom Summer, said, let's bring in some students to get some attention, because we want to really focus on this. Now, there was a real fight. Even though I was young, I was hearing about it going on between the SNCC workers themselves and COFO workers themselves about whether to invite in white students, right? A decision was made to invite them in with the focus that they would come in and help black people get registered to vote.
Okay.
During that same period, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party concept was coming about. That was Fannie Lou Hamer, Bob Moses, and all of them saying, and that's also related to voting. The state of Mississippi is saying black folk don't want to vote.
Right.
So then we're going to prove them a lie. We're going to have these we're going to have this ways for black people to register and all over the state. And we're going to have a way for them to have a convention, which they can go to, and they can pick their candidates that they want to be part of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, with the idea that you're going to go to Atlantic City in August of 1964.
As delegates to the
delegates to the convention.
Democratic National Convention.
That was
in Atlantic City, New Jersey.
Atlantic City, New Jersey. So all that work was been going on to prove, given all this barrier, given all this pushback by the whole state, including the governor, lieutenant governor, everything in Mississippi at that time was white elected. Statewide officials, state governments, House, Senate. So the idea was, here's a state that's 45% black at that time, if not more, and don't have I think 2 or 3% registered voters across the state. We got to do something about that. They proved by having this mock voting and mock election and mock ballots that black people would participate.
Yeah.
Now, black people knew that, but I think they needed to prove it so people could see. So part of that thing was about registration and getting some exposure, because they knew the convention was going to take place. Johnson had already signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but that had nothing whatsoever to do with voting. They didn't do nothing about voting. Right. So
Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 on July 2nd, 1964, in the middle of that summer, and it had been prompted and it had been pushed. And, it goes through the House and the Senate before it actually ends up on the president's desk for months. And a lot of that came out of Alabama, out of the Birmingham campaign in Alabama, the murder of the 4 little girls at 16th Street Baptist Church on September 15th, 1963.
Yes.
But all of those efforts and all of those movements pushed the March on Washington, August 28th, 1963, was demanding that. But as you said, the Civil Rights Act in 1964 dealt with public accommodations.
Correct.
It did not deal with
voting.
The right to vote.
And the right to vote was just becoming pivotal, particularly in the state of Mississippi, but I think they're all over the South. And so, back to your point about the Freedom Summer. So once this debate took place about whether to bring in these students, they make that decision. Then the question would be, how can you get them trained? Because these 2 kids, middle class kids, upper middle class kids, had no idea, none. We had some idea, because I used to tell SNCC workers, even people like Cleveland Sellers and Ivanhoe Donaldson. Cleveland went on to be president of a college there in South Carolina. Right. I used to drive them around, and because I could tell them where the back roads were. I said, guys, you don't want to come here and drive the main roads. You need to know where the back roads are. So me and some other folk locally that knew the roads taught them those things, how to do that. That was for their own protection and for our protection. So this notion of these kids coming down, I think they meant well, and many of them did good things, but they had no idea what they were getting in. Right. So part of that training that they did in Ohio was to prepare them. And during the time they were being prepared, and that's when they got the word that workers were missing. And I think Bob and others said at that time, and black people knew at that time, when you go missing in Mississippi, at that time, you dead.
And then Mickey Schwerner, who was a white civil rights organizer, and Andrew Goodman, who you told me had just come down to Mississippi. What part of Mississippi were they?
The Neshoba County, which is about 70 miles from east of Jackson, and the town in the Neshoba County is Philadelphia. Isn't that irony? Right. Philadelphia, the land of the free, right? So
brotherly love, supposedly.
Yeah, brotherly love. But keep in mind, we talked about that SPAC agency before, right?
The sovereignty agency.
So things have a way of running a circle. So here's a situation where how did the sheriff's department and the Klan knew that they were going to investigate the bombing, because they've been bombing the churches.
And they went to the church to
investigate a bombing,
right,
outside of Philadelphia, in Neshoba County, and right away. When they came away from that, they were arrested. So communication was going on between the so-called law enforcement and the Klan and the Spy Commission.
Right.
Which means that when you would cross state lines, like Goodman came in, they already had the stuff on Mickey Schwerner, and they already had the stuff on James Chaney, because they were locally organized. And the word went out what to do with these guys. I think the first thing was, well, we're not ready to kill him at this point. But finally, the Dragon, who turned out to be a preacher, by the way, and then we'll talk about that little statement later. They killed him, and as you say, it wasn't found until August. During that time, other bodies were being discovered. As they were looking for these bodies, 8 or 9 black bodies were being discovered.
While they were looking for Chaney, Schwerner, and Goodman,
they found bodies.
They found other bodies.
Correct.
That of people who had been murdered, who had
exactly.
been killed by the forces of white supremacy, by the Klan, by sheriffs.
Exactly.
And what was the reason why they even came to look for Chaney, Schwerner, and Goodman? What was the motivation, since there was already these other people missing, apparently? What in your view was the motivation for why this massive effort to come look for them even happened?
Well, the pressure was on the Justice Department and on Johnson at that point, and on Hoover, who is no fan of black people, right? But the pressure, again, the local pressure coming from all these organizations, black and white, were putting a lot of pressure on. And then Johnson put a lot of pressure on Hoover, because what the authorities at the time were saying, well, these guys, nothing happened to them. This is just a setup. To bring a ticket.
They went back up to Chicago.
Yeah, they went back to Chicago somewhere, whatever. So the idea was just to push this off as being insignificant. But the pressure was so massive that they had to come in and engage. And had there not been that kind of pressure, and then given the fact that it was already getting national attention, and also given the fact these were two white boys, in addition to one black young man who was killed, added even more pressure.
Yeah.
You know, so
What did you the movie Mississippi Burning with William Dafoe and Gene Hackman deals with
some aspects of
case.
it.
What did you think of that movie?
Well, it was okay. You know, it's makeup. They made it sound like the FBI was hero.
Right.
FBI was no hero in Mississippi.
Right.
But that's Hollywood, right?
That's Hollywood.
But part of what America gets is Hollywood. And so that's Hollywood. So when they heard about this movie, they see about all these good folk and these FBI agents. No, Hoover had to be actually pulled to do his job, which was to find these workers. And then they obviously, they paid some money to this informer who told them where the bodies were. And then the preacher, when they did have a trial, they never brought him to trial for murder because Mississippi had never brought white people to trial for killing black people at that time. So they brought him up on civil rights charges. And some of the deputies, sheriffs, were convicted on civil rights charges, given 5 or 6 years, something like that. But the real culprit, a guy named Killen, who's a preacher, during the trial, a woman said, even on that civil rights charge, she couldn't convict Killen because he was a preacher. But later on, we had a very progressive district attorney out of the Jackson area, and I was in Jackson at that time as county administrator, and I was proud to see what they did. They did bring him up on manslaughter charge, and this time around, they were able to convict him of manslaughter on 3 counts, and he got 60 years. He died in prison some years later. So there was some semblance of justice, even though
justice delayed, but not necessarily totally denied.
Correct.
Yes. So you were here in 1964 during Freedom Summer, in the midst of this, the murder of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman on June 21st, 1964. This push from these organizations and pressure on Johnson and Hoover to come and to find these missing civil rights workers. And then on August the 4th, 1964, they found them in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Tell me about, do you remember when that happened? Like where you were or what was happening around you at
very
that
much
time?
remember. I was working, still working as a young volunteer with SNCC. And so I was, being updated as much as not only from the press, but about people that worked there in Hollow Springs with SNCC was, talking about what was happening with the workers and what had happened. And there was some sense that when that happened, that people would just, kind of pack their bags and go. But I think the opposite happened. I think people got recommitted to do things in Mississippi related to voter registration. Recommitted after that fact. I don't know any white workers that I knew of decided to go back home because of this, the murder of these 3 workers. In terms of me, I was making preparation along with some other people to go to Atlantic City, which happened, I think, 24th or something like that of August. And so
For the Democratic National Convention.
The Democratic
in
National
Atlantic City.
Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey.
That was nominating at the time Lyndon B. Johnson for his. He became president in '63 following the assassination of Kennedy on November 22nd. But so this was his first time that he was now going to be nominated as the presidential candidate.
Exactly, with Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota as his vice president.
So you drove through Philadelphia, Mississippi,
on
your way to Atlantic City.
And that was only a few weeks, or less than a few weeks after they found the body. So the idea of these murders was fresh in all of our memories because it just happened, right? And so we headed on to Atlantic City.
Y'all were courage or crazy, or both.
Or combination. And my daughter asked the question sometimes. She said, you must have felt safe because you were with some older workers. I said, no, these workers weren't that much older. I mean, I may have been 16. They were in their early to mid 20s, so they weren't that old. But I think you're right. We either were courageous or crazy. But anyway, God
was with you.
Thank God. We got through it, got to Atlantic City, and was able to be there with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party.
Fannie Lou Hamer,
Aaron Henry. Wow. Aaron Henry was a pharmacist from Clarksdale. Fannie Lou Hamer was a sharecropper from the Mississippi Delta. and they were the two, I would say, well known. Now there was a white fellow, Ed King, who was the running mate with Aaron Henry. Miss Fanner was just only within the group as an advocate. She wasn't actively running.
Not a candidate.
Not a candidate.
She was a delegate.
She was a delegate
for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party.
And spoke, before the credential committee.
So what happened in Atlantic City?
So
with that?
we got there. We didn't have a hotel because we didn't have the funds. Had sleeping bags, and so we slept on the
courageous, crazy, and broke.
So we slept on the boardwalk at night in a sleeping bag.
You slept on the boardwalk in a sleeping bag.
That's exactly right. And said during the day, you had activity going on at the convention. I don't know how many people have been to a national convention, but a lot of stuff is going on inside. On the outside, we are picketing because we want to put the pressure on the other states to do the right thing and seat the Mississippi.
And seat the delegates of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party.
And so from time to time while we were there, Miss Fannie Lou Hamer, the woman that we know now that people didn't know then, would come out onto the boardwalk and as a way to lift our spirit, would sing. And Miss Hamer just had this wonderful booming voice. And so, song was so much a part of the freedom movement anyway, right? So we sang all the time. But it was just extra bonus to have her come to the boardwalk and actually sing.
When we started this State on Freedom podcast, she was absolutely essential. I mean, I had her voice ringing in my mind when I even thought about what we should call it. And so when people listen to this podcast at the beginning and the end and they hear that voice singing, woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom, that's Fannie Lou Hamer. Now, ultimately, what did the Democratic Party do in response to these efforts to have the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party?
Well, the Democratic Party do what political parties do. They play political games, right? So the idea was that the right thing for them to do was to seat the Mississippi Freedom Democratic, which was integrated, and get rid of the Dixiecrats,
right?
The all-white delegation. But politics being what it is, and even though they had some allies from Michigan and Illinois and places like that, California, they didn't have enough to convince Johnson and even some of the people from the labor unions who were not necessarily supportive of the delegation getting seated. They gave them what I call token. They said you can be honorary. We'll give you 2 honorary seats, one to Aaron Henry and one to Ed King. And Ed King, being a minister from Jackson at the time, said, look, give Miss Hamer this seat that I have, because I don't want to overstep her. And Miss Hamer made the statement, which became universal. We didn't come all this far,
right?
For no token vote.
For a token vote.
And so they went back home. They did what they wanted to do in terms of bringing before the nation the just cause, that these people were the real Democrats. These other people were not. And as soon as they did not get seated, Goldwater was the nominee on the Republican side from Arizona.
Senator Barry Goldwater from
Arizona. And Johnson made that statement. He said, now, when I support this effort to push for civil rights and to push for voting rights, which is tied to what that the South is gonna move from being Democrat, Dixiecrat to all Republicans, which is what happened. And so in '68.
So it's interesting you say that. So I will say a little bit more about the convention and the present moment. So that shift of the Democratic Party, Dixiecrat Party becoming Republican, we're tracking that to happening around 1964.
65, 66.
65, 66. But then we see Ronald Reagan announcing his presidential campaign in 1980, where?
In Philadelphia, Mississippi.
In Philadelphia, Mississippi.
County.
In the same place
right.
where the three civil rights workers, where Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman were found. And that presidential campaign is also identified as where a big shift of so-called Reagan Democrats and those who had remained in the Democratic Party, the last vestiges of the Dixiecrats that were still in the Democratic Party, then made the formal switch and became Republicans in 1980 and have remained
That's right.
Republicans ever since.
That code was not a code. It was not a dog whistle. I mean, it was very clear what Ronald Reagan was doing.
Right.
And it was.
Tell us what was he doing?
Well, he was continuing the legacy of Goldwater, which is saying this party will make a fundamental shift to the right. Mm-hmm. And that even if there had been some considered moderate Republicans from Illinois and places like that, we're going to shift this party away from the so-called moderate Republicans, which was similar to the Republicans that came out after the Civil War.
Yeah, but that's pretty, isn't that extreme? I mean, it's not just we're shifting it to conservative to the right. You go back to a place which was a burial ground of black people and freedom-fighting people that had received national and international attention, and you announce and launch your presidential campaign from Philadelphia, Mississippi, from the place where they found these civil rights workers murdered.
Did we talk about some earlier called the lost cause?
The lost cause.
So Reagan didn't go to California to do that. He came to Mississippi.
He was a governor of California, but comes to Philadelphia, Mississippi.
Exactly. And so what did the South do? The South had been solid before. The solid South. And with a little bit of breakage in Georgia recently, and way ahead, the South became a solid Dixiecrat party again.
Wow.
So back about history repeating itself, you have the Civil War, you have Reconstruction, you have
that pendulum.
Yes,
swinging
the pendulum swings back. And it swung back not in a moderate way, it swung back in an extremist way.
Right. And what's happening? What are your thoughts about today? Democratic National Convention's coming up in Chicago, interestingly enough, which was another interesting moment for the next one was 1968. But this year, the Democratic National Convention is happening in 2024. There's been a whole lot of conversation about what's going to happen with that and what's not going to happen with that. Any thoughts, any wisdom, reflections to share on that?
Well, one of the things that I believe as a political scientist and as a historian, that the more things change, the more they remain the same to some extent. Now, that's not to say there has been tremendous change in this country. Structurally, there's not been a whole lot. Symbolism, though, there's been quite a bit. So we have that what we just talked about, that solid South. And so if you look at the Republican Party, which is now Trump Party, and one could call the party of the 60s Goldwater Party. You could call the party of the 80s
the Reagan
Party. And now you have clearly the Trump Party. So that's where you are now. And that's where the Republican Party is right now. And to some extent, if you look at some of these states, they've been expanded from that solid South. Now you got the solid South and the solid Midwest to some extent, and even going out further towards the West, the Southwest. So there are, while there are differences, there are some similarities.
Right.
People do have the right to vote now, though. Whereas before in '64, people that wanted to vote could not vote. People can clearly vote. Even though you got barriers, they can clearly vote. So I believe now in 2024, people do have, and I said people collectively now have more control over their political destiny than they did in '64 or even in 1968.
And will we decide to exercise
that? Now that's going to be the $1 million question. Will people decide to collectively use that authority to vote to avoid a major sustainable shift, particularly in light of the Supreme Court's decision, which now has granted the executive almost king-like power, and has now made in my judgment, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence a policy document, whereas the law is what the judges say it is, as opposed to what Scalia would argue is that we are originalists, and therefore we're going to go back to what the founders intended. So there's some shifts going on.
You made this remarkable trajectory from Mississippi, from the midst of the movement, from the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, from the cattle barn, from prep school to Brandeis University, all of these honors, all of these degrees, all of this access, all of these opportunities. And for many people, and there aren't many who would even travel that's extremely rare in and of itself, they would never look back. They would never decide that where they would want to see their ultimate destination would be back home in the same state, in the same communities, continuing to doing the same work. So as we close, tell us a little bit about, after you received all of this with a passport to go anywhere in the world, that you decided that you wanted to come back home. Why is that?
You asked a question that my advisor, when I did African history, was one of my areas, along with political theory and political science, and also American government. Asked me the question. I think the day or so after I received her doctorate, she had been my advisor, and she said, "What do you plan to do?" And her name was Ruth Morgenthau. She's
Say that again.
Ruth Morgenthau.
Ruth Morgenthau.
She was related to the Morgenthaus from New York. She was married into that family, very wealthy family, and she traveled all over the world. She was fluent in French. She was an expert in French West Africa. Mm-hmm. And so she asked me a question: why are you going back to Mississippi when you have, first of all, there are not that many black folk in 1978 getting PhDs from Brandeis or from Harvard, Yale, any other place for that matter.
Right.
And so you're getting this PhD from Brandeis in 1978, and you're telling me you were going back to Mississippi when you could be right here in Massachusetts or New York or California, Chicago, and make 3 times more money than you're going to make going back to Mississippi. I see you're right about the money thing. But you miss out on another point, and that is that I've been blessed to get these things, and I think I have an obligation to go back and give back and do something. It's all right to be a small fish in a big lake or a big ocean, which I would be in Massachusetts, but I can come back to a small place like Mississippi or a small town like Hollis Springs or a small place like Jackson, and get with other people and make more of an impact than I can. And it's not about the material things anyway. That'll come. I don't need a lot of material things, but I have to be engaged in a way that it makes a difference, and I have to feel good about what I'm doing.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And so I think that was the driving thing, wanting to make a difference and not being driven by the material thing of making a lot of money. Because again, I could have been set in a place like Massachusetts.
Well, we give thanks that you came back home, that you've come back to Mississippi, that you've come back to the South, that you've come to the Alabama African American Civil Rights Heritage Sites Consortium. Tell us, and you serve as one of our leading members of our board of directors, but you're also continuing your work. You haven't just come home and sat down. You are continuing to do work through the consortium, but also in your own nonprofit work. Tell us about, as we close out, what you're doing now, and if you have any final words of reflection or wisdom that you can share with us.
Well, when Ted reached out, Ted DeBerry, who is the chairman of the board of the consortium, reached out to me about serving. I initially was going to say no, but it's hard to say no to Ted.
He is, indeed.
But then when he told me about what he was doing, about this historical legacy thing, and I've always had great respect for the work that's gone on in Birmingham and Montgomery and Selma, because we talked about that relationship between Stokely Carmichael, right? Toure had worked in the Alabama Delta. Matter of fact, they coined that phrase, Black Power, when even though here in Mississippi, a guy named Willie Ricks.
Mukasa. He was one of my mentors.
Okay.
When I was in Atlanta, Morehouse College, he used to come and bang on my door and say, "Hey, African," and we would argue all night, and the
Yeah.
whole dorm in Du Bois Hall would come and sit in the hallway and listen to us debate.
Well, I got you. Well, he's the one that, and I told Willie last time I saw him, it's been years now. I said, contrary to what people say, you coined that phrase.
He absolutely did.
And of course, Stokely 2 days later said, I didn't coin it, I used it.
He sent him ahead to go and test it out to see
Exactly.
how it would work.
Exactly.
And Mukasa Willie Ricks, if people don't know Willie Ricks, Mukasa Dada, look him up, Google him, but he is the one who introduced the phrase, the slogan, the chant, Black Power.
Absolutely.
Was it Greek?
It was in the Delta.
In
During
the
march,
Delta,
during
Mississippi.
that march, when they're doing that merited march. So to your answer your question again. So yeah, when you reach out and you see the kind of good work that's been done in terms of these historical preservation, but you see, you're more than just focused on the history part. You also, you're teaching about the present and the future, because it seems to me it's very important to know from which you came. You get great respect. When I spent some time during the Arab Spring, ARAB, in Egypt, I was struck by one of the first questions that I got asked by some of the people in Egypt was the fact that they knew about the civil rights movement. They knew about the work we had done in Mississippi, but they also knew about the work that had done on Alabama and Selma and Birmingham and Montgomery. And so we talked about that universal stuff, that knowing this is a local issue, a national issue, a universal. So when there's an opportunity to connect with somebody in another state that's similar in a lot of ways, although larger cities, I can relate to that, and I want to be a part of that. And then and I've been really, really impressed with what I've seen since I've been on that board, and the kind of progress you and others are making as you lead that organization forward to take it to a whole nother level. I'm very impressed with that. In terms of my own nonprofit, it was just a continuation of what I do and want to give back to local people. And I almost take the old philosophy of B.B. King. He said he's going to play blues until he dies. So my philosophy is I'm going to work in this area of some capacity until I die.
Amen. Well, brother, thank you so much. I mean, as we were driving over from Alabama to Mississippi, we talked about how in a negative way, people oftentimes look at Alabama and Mississippi and they see us, and sometimes in Alabama, we're always at the bottom of all of these different lists of quality of life. We're at numbers 49 and 50. And sometimes, so Alabama doesn't always have to be last. They say, well, we say, thank God for Mississippi, because Mississippi sometimes is 50 to our 49th. But as we close, I say thank God for Mississippi in a completely different way. We thank God for Mississippi because without Mississippi, there would be no freedom movement in Alabama. Without Alabama, there would be no freedom movement in Mississippi. And really, it's the whole Southern Black Belt. It's looking at Louisiana, looking at Mississippi, looking at Alabama, looking at Georgia, looking at South Carolina. But we are a family of communities that have been engaged in a continuing struggle. The struggle continues because those lists are unacceptable in terms of continuing conditions in this modern moment. But we know that we have deep roots and we have foundation in our freedom soil.
Ashe.
And we're gonna stay on freedom.
Ashe.
So, brother, thank you. Ashe,
Thank
Ashe,
you.
Ashe. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roy DeBerry, and thank you for joining us in this episode of Stayed on Freedom.